I'm DC.
And I'm Michael.
And you're listening to the Monster Guys podcast. Tonight, we bring you 4 cases of the bizarre, the strange, and the often unexplained. This is a special edition of the Monster Guys podcast, Monsters Among Us, Friday the 13th edition. Welcome to a special edition of the Monster Guys podcast. We are right in the middle of our October series, Monsters Among Us, where we're talking about real-life monsters in human history. On this very special Friday the 13th edition, we have 4 specific cases that we're going to talk about. Michael, let's go to the very first one. This is a very bizarre and brutal case. It began around 1969. And kind of kept going through the mid-70s. Right now, the death toll on this case is almost at 60, as far as we know. And as far as we know, these deaths are unsolved. The only thing that we do know about them is that the murders were largely against groups of young people that were traveling a southern road in Texas between the years of 1969 and I think around 1973. There's a particularly famous set of murders that happened together in in August of 73, and that's the one we want to talk about tonight as the first case in this Monsters Among Us special edition. What can you tell me about this case right now? It's brutal. I will warn people, this episode we're going to talk about some things that are kind of gruesome, but we're not going to go off the rails here. So we're not going to be in trouble with mom or dad driving down the road with kids in the back seat. But just know there's some gruesome things that took place in the midst of these cases, and we do want you to know that we're going to be discussing those today.
I think that warning is definitely necessary, especially diving into this first one. Out of the 4 really strange cases that we have tonight, this one deals with some pretty violent happenings. There's not a lot that we can say. So we do know that this happened in Travis County, in Texas, around that area. There were, as you said, a lot of groups of teenagers specifically that were going missing, entire cars of people that would just disappear. Oftentimes, those people would be going on trips, just vacations, and neither they nor their vehicles were ever really found. There is one instance that we can talk about in greater detail, and that is the story of Sally Hardesty and some of her friends and her brother who was confined to a wheelchair, I guess for all of his life.
And they were all traveling together this summer during this particular road trip or whatever it was they were doing. They were together on this trip.
Yeah. They were passing by, I guess, a location that Sally and Franklin, her brother, that they had kind of grown up around. And I guess they stopped at that location because at the time, there was a news report talking about how there was a certain cemetery where graves were being dug up. And I guess it was pretty gruesome. Some of the corpses were completely missing. They were talking about dozens of graves having been dug up and dozens of bodies being missing. But some of the bodies had actually been almost reconstructed around certain statues around the cemetery.
Yeah, I was going to say the news reports at that time described skeletal remains being placed on grave sites. Some of these graves that had been disturbed were then used, those remains were used to, I guess, desecrate other parts of the graveyard.
And I don't want to say artfully so, but I guess it was very methodical and slightly artistic in a very sick and twisted way. So somebody was really messed up in the head when they were doing this. So there was obviously there were a lot of people that were upset by this, and crowds were gathering in that cemetery. So they stopped by just to make sure that their own family graves hadn't been, messed with. From there, they kind of disappear off the map for a little while.
Well, what's interesting about that as well is that attention seekers, or doomsday prophets, if you will, kind of honed in on that as kind of a end of the world type scenario, shouting out their prophecies at people who were visiting the graveyard and, talking about the things that they were seeing, the evil in the world. So it was, it drew a lot of attention.
Yeah, if you think about it, that would be upsetting in today's time. But if you think about way back then, when it was really a much simpler time, there was a lot going on politically as well that seemed to be bringing on an apparent end of the world. A lot of lies that were being uncovered in the government, just a lot of fear happening around that time. So obviously people were very, ruffled.
Well, and the newsreel, just like in our own time, was nothing but negative, so it just fed the hysteria and the paranoia.
Yeah, so Sally and her friends, they kind of went off-road for a while. We don't have much that we can actually go on except for Sally's report later on, and unfortunately, I will say she did survive the events of that night, but after running into the authorities, she very quickly went into a catatonic state and stopped speaking from then on. So we have very few bits of information that were kind of taken out of what really seemed to be ramblings and ravings after she was found.
But if even a portion of her rantings and ravings were even close to being accurate, this is one of the most horrific set of events that I've ever heard anybody experiencing.
Yeah. So what she described happening, they stopped at an old family property, found it to be kind of overgrown at the time it had been let go, and one by one, her friends wandered off and they didn't come back. So she and her brother Franklin were waiting for them to come back when it started getting dark out. So she and Franklin went to look for her friends, one of them being her boyfriend named Jerry. So they were calling for their friends, trying to look for them, when they came across a man in the woods wearing a strange mask that looked like it had been made of what seemed to be human skin, which I don't know about you, but that would really drive me up the wall.
That's kind of terrifying.
From what Sally described, her brother was then murdered very quickly with a chainsaw, and she was soon after captured and taken to this almost house of horrors. I guess she actually ran into the house looking for help, ran back out because she realized, oh crap, this is where this guy actually lives. And what she describes is it's a house of horrors. They had bones that were kind of constructed along railings and placed on chairs almost as if they were part of the chair's construction. She found decomposing corpses that were still sitting in chairs up in some of the upper floors of the house. And eventually she was captured by these people and sat at a dinner table with them while they were eating what could only presumably be human. She also described seeing things such as roadkill on the table. So again, just a very gruesome set of events for her. I guess the time came that they were actually about to murder her. And because of the dysfunction between the killers, she said that there were 3 men specifically who seemed to be all kind of bickering with each other. She was able to get away. And
and they were treating her like cattle.
Yeah,
as though she was cattle that they were getting ready to slaughter.
Yeah,
according to her.
It's interesting. I actually forgot about that. She had apparently run into one of these people before. He was hitchhiking along the road, and he actually was talking about how his family used to work at an old slaughterhouse, and he was describing the methods by which they would slaughter cows, which was something that was about to happen to her. But thankfully she did get away, and like I said, she was able to get away with the help of a guy in a pickup truck, get to the authorities long enough to kind of give something of a statement, although it was very disjointed and frenetic. But given the state she was in, they could never actually pinpoint the locations. They searched all throughout Travis County, but they never found the farmhouse or the places that she described. And her friends and brother remain missing, presumably dead to this day.
Yeah, and given her injuries, the reports of what she sustained, it's kind of a no small miracle that she got out of that place.
Yeah.
In one piece, especially. But I mean, you look at the head trauma and the wounds, knife wounds, apparently, and the beatings that she took, blunt force trauma and I don't know that anybody has identified exactly what she was beaten with, but all of that combined, I mean...
Well, I think based on the reports, it actually looked like she was hit with, the type of sledgehammer that would be used to slaughter cattle, which is in line with her story.
Just the fact that she got away was, obviously no small miracle, but then to survive that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, how do you continue on after an experience like that?
Unfortunately, there was not much that did continue on. I guess she did live out something of a life, but as I said, she was catatonic after that for, as far as I know, the rest of her life. In those murders, the string of missing persons, they're all kind of attributed by some theorists to that group of people, but it's never been confirmed, and those missing persons have never been found.
Yeah, so a very unfortunate string of events that began, like we said, in the late 60s and continued on through the mid-70s, and it's just a bizarre set of unsolved murders and torture, and like you said, the locations can't be found or haven't been found to this point. There's been nobody that has been arrested or anything. But what's even more interesting is that this particular set of events actually spawned several films that have taken place almost ever since, but especially in the decade following those murders and those disappearances. There were several films that were produced that were based on or directly inspired by those events.
Yeah, and they were very controversial. Some of the films were banned in some countries, and to the point that even the words in the titles were banned, so that copycat films or people who were inspired by that film making a similar film were also banned if they used anything similar in the title. So a very controversial topic, and still to this day one of the strangest and more upsetting American mysteries.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with your words there. Let's go to the next case. This takes place late 70s, around 1978. Sometimes evil is closer to home than we think. And that was what Peter and Edith Myers discovered on October 31st, 1963, when they came home from a date. One of their 3 children, Michael Myers, was standing in the front yard holding a bloody kitchen knife. Imagine that scene, if you will, coming home to that.
Yeah, definitely.
Running inside, Peter discovered their eldest daughter, Judith, had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, and she was dead. Michael was only 6 years old at the time. This is a powerful and very touching and, again, terrifying series of events because it was so close to home. This was all taking place, or at least started within this family that had to endure this, and then it spread from there later on.
Yeah, very similar timeline to the things going on in Texas as well. Started early 60s, and then it actually ended up carrying on into the late 70s, like you said, and I think I don't know, there's speculation that some of the same events were happening that were happening in the 80s were connected, but it was miles apart.
Right. I started out by saying this happened in the late 70s, and this is the particular case that we're going to be talking about, but it began in the 60s with this child. Connect us from the 60s to the late 70s with this case that we're talking about now, because it's all connected to that boy.
It's connected, and wow, it's convoluted as well. So Michael Myers was actually taken very quickly from his home to Smith's Grove Sanitarium, which was a psychiatric hospital. There he was kind of held in place. A lot of the people were trying to help fix him, if you will. Perhaps that's not the best way to say it, but they were trying to figure out, what had snapped in this kid's head.
And I'm not sure all the methods for finding stuff like that out during that time were the greatest.
No, probably not. For the town of Haddonfield, which is where he was from, that house where he murdered his sister was kind of the haunted house on the street, if you will. So for the longest time, it seemed like the place the boogeyman would hang out. It was
Well,
kind of
yeah, I mean,
avoided.
it was condemned, or at least it was run down, so it had the appearance of this very sinister place, that housed the evil that took place there so many years ago, and apparently they couldn't keep tenants or could not get tenants into that location since that event took place. So, like you said, it was very much the spooky house in the neighborhood, and every time you walked by or, looked out your window and saw it, it's the type of thing that would give you chills and you would quickly pass on.
I can't say that I blame them. I mean, okay, so 15 years later, it ended up, nobody, of course, knew this at the time in Haddonfield, but one Dr. Sam Loomis was driving up to the sanitarium, which he worked at, with a nurse by the name of Marion Chambers.
And I believe that he was Michael's doctor.
Yes.
At least in his later years.
Yes. Actually, no, he was one of the first people to meet Michael when Michael was brought to
Okay,
the
so he was with him
institution.
the whole time.
Yeah. Actually, he had a very powerful statement that he gave to the police later on, saying that he basically, from the moment that he met Michael Myers, he saw this 6-year-old boy and all he could see behind his eyes was evil. Just that there was this force of evil that could not recognize any love or compassion or right or wrong. There was just this rage to kill and to murder. So according to him, he actually spent the first 7 years of his working relationship, if you want to call it that, with Michael trying to help the boy. And then when he realized he could no longer help him, he spent the next 8 years trying to keep him from getting back out into the real world when he grew up.
Yeah, and so you're talking about an evening when he was driving up to pay a visit to the sanitarium.
Yes, what he describes is that they found a bunch of the patients had broken out of the sanitarium, and they were just kind of milling about the yard. The gate was open.
I mean, do we have any idea how they broke out? Do we know what happened? Was there an event?
That's still unknown to this day. There have been no clear answers. It was something that Sam Loomis himself was very upset with, people at the institution, specifically because of Michael Myers. He was terrified. Like I said, he spent 8 years trying to make sure that he did not get released back into the world for any second chance. So
I think he was even upset at the possibility of Michael being transferred to another location where there was a potential of what many probably would consider like a parole or something,
right,
or even a release.
Yeah. So it seemed that, Sam Loomis had this sense of responsibility to the world to keep Michael Myers behind the walls of that particular sanitarium. So he was obviously very upset that night when he found that people had broken out. He got out of the car to try to do a little bit of investigation, try to calm down the events. And what happened was that a man actually jumped on the roof of the car and started attacking Marion Chambers. She got out, afraid for her life, and the man jumped in the car and drove away. Well, lo and behold, that man did turn out to be Michael Myers. And to the dismay of Sam Loomis, I guess he stayed behind to kind of take a head count, make sure that Michael was still in the sanitarium. And when he realized that he was not, he immediately called the authorities in Haddonfield to give them a warning that he believed Michael Myers was coming back into town.
And they didn't take him very seriously, at least not at first. They were kind of lighthearted about it, like it wasn't really a possibility, and that the doctor was a little bit paranoid himself.
I feel sorry for him because when 15 years have passed, I can imagine people would have forgotten. The house is still there, but again, it's the place of the boogeyman. So who's going to think that a kid's going to come back 15 years later? There's nothing really left for him there. So I feel bad for Loomis because he was actually trying really hard. He immediately got in his car after calling and made the drive to Haddonfield himself to track down Michael Myers. So he was really hoofing it, trying to take this under wing.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about the case, they later discovered that he made a stop to make a phone call, and this was back during a time when you had payphones out in the middle of nowhere. He stopped to make a phone call, and at that phone station, he noticed that there was an abandoned truck. He didn't do a whole lot of searching at the time. He just noticed a set of clothing that made him wonder, but it was later reported and discovered that that was a stop where Michael Myers had murdered somebody, changed clothes, and made his way back to Haddonfield. And I don't think it really dawned on him what he was looking at, because he was in such a rush to get back to the town to rescue whoever he could rescue. But he was on the trail right there in that halfway point at that pit stop.
You make a good point. I had kind of forgotten about that, because later on, we'll get to this, but later on they actually gave a head count, or a body count, if you will, because unfortunately Michael Myers did actually get to Haddonfield, and he did go on 2 killing sprees in the same night. But I don't think that body count actually accounted for the guy at that pit stop, just because he wasn't from Haddonfield. They didn't realize he had any connection to it until a later time, like you said.
Yeah, and you're talking about the 2 killing sprees in the same night, which happened to be on Halloween night.
Yeah.
Which is another reason why the authorities at first took it kind of lightly. They were just kind of like, kids playing pranks, messing around in an old abandoned house. There's nothing really to this. Yeah. And they didn't want to fool with it. They had enough issues dealing with the safety of kids out trick-or-treating, and certainly in a small town like this, they had never heard of such a thing. So how could this happen to us?
Yep, and it really is unfortunate. So there was a girl by the name of Laurie Strode. She kind of takes a similar position to who we just spoke about, Sally, from the events in Texas. She kind of plays the survivor role in this night. I think it was just by chance that she ran across this guy who she described as stalking her and her friends earlier that day, and she noticed him actually looking up at her from behind a white, shapeless mask when she got home from school that day. Well, she didn't think too much of it. She thought maybe, people are just playing pranks. Her friends kind of laughed it off when she described it to them. And
and it was in the middle of the daytime when she first saw, so it was almost like just somebody playing around with their Halloween costume.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it turned out that actually was Michael Myers. Several people saw him in that same mask later that night. Several of them sadly dying, but he stalked them. He actually picked her friends off one by one in a house across the street, actually.
While she was babysitting and was unaware of what was going on.
And I'm glad you bring that up. Given the time period, I think this is actually where some of those babysitting urban legends come from. There actually were some cases during this era of, babysitting mishaps, if you will, people breaking into the house and terrifying babysitters. This is actually one of the cases of a more deadly happening. But he did, across the street, pick off her friends one by one, as I said. I believe he stabbed them with kitchen knives the entire time. So
Which is what he started out with 15 years prior.
Yeah, I think it was part of his psychosis. It seemed to be something he was kind of attached to. So he went after Laura Strode, started coming after her. She actually she had already been on edge, so she was not necessarily prepared, but she was a bit more apt to protect herself. She reportedly injured him a few times, taking his own knife from him, stabbing him, poking him in the eye with a coat hanger throughout that night. And she seemed to run around, make him chase her long enough that Sam Loomis actually got into town and found both of them. And he shot Michael Myers 6 times before Michael Myers fell out of a window on the 2nd story. And from there, they thought they were finished. The body was actually gone, though, when they went to look out the window, which is pretty creepy. Nobody to this day knows how he survived.
It just kind of reminds me of some of those old police reports that, people hyped up on heroin or PCP or something like that. You mow them down with an army and they're still walking.
Yeah, I remember you telling me a story of a guy who picked up a chair and tossed it at a few police officers that were trying to tackle the guy.
Yeah.
And that may have been it. He may have been under the influence of something. He may, I guess with somebody who had no emotion, no sense of right or wrong, there may have been some sort of mental strength that turned into physical strength as well.
Like an overriding system.
Like a constant adrenaline almost.
Yeah.
So he survived. Laura was taken to the hospital for some of her injuries, and Michael actually followed her there and killed several of the staff that night. I believe the final body count that people gave was actually 19 people, and he also killed 2 dogs during the midst of this.
That's crazy.
Yeah, all in one Halloween night in the 1970s.
Except for Lori, she survived.
Yes, she survived. She, again, was able to basically run around the hospital and avoid him narrowly. I guess what ended up happening is she and Sam Loomis met up again in this room where Sam actually started to open up canisters of flammable gas, I guess, and he told her to get out. And when Michael Myers walked in the room, he lit a match and blew up the room. And from there, she was finally safe. So it's good that she survived, but still another horrible tragedy and a very bizarre case. I mean, it took a lot to take this guy down.
Yeah, and in a strange twist, Laurie Strode later found out that she had a relation to this kid. I think that just added to the tension and the layers of horror that she was experiencing just having gone through these events. And from what I understand, of course, this is modern history, so we're not talking too many years ago. And from what I understand, I don't know if it's a team that's producing a documentary about this set of events or something else, but they're going back to that location and she's going with them to retell the story. And somehow it's kind of a way, through her therapy, through her counseling, I'm not sure, but it's kind of a way for her to go back and face Michael Myers one last time and overcome the tragedy that she experienced.
Yeah, which I think is admirable of her.
Yeah, I don't know if it's smart, but it's admirable.
Well, the best of luck to her. And,
yeah, I'm not her therapist, so otherwise I'd tell her to run.
It's probably something that I'll keep an eye out. I didn't know she was doing that, so I'll have to keep an eye out.
Well, I think it was recent news, and some of the people that were closely associated with the case have been a part of this and some of the counsel and everything surrounding it. So we'll see. I think they said they're going to release this story and their findings and some of the interviews sometime next year. So we'll see.
Yeah, and maybe at that point we'll figure out, because I think some people have theorized this and that, but maybe we'll finally hear from her and know exactly what truly went on that night. Because there are a lot of questions that still rise to this day.
Okay, Michael, let's move forward a little bit in history. Around 1979, the night was Friday the 13th. It was the month of June, and by all accounts, there was a full moon that hung in the sky that night. It was raining heavily, and for Crystal Lake, New Jersey, a horrific event was about to take place. Now, what's interesting about this is though it happened in the late 70s, its history actually reaches farther back in the 50s, farther back than even some of the cases that we talked about in Texas earlier. So this area in New Jersey had a very long history of tragedy, and it was almost like it came full circle to this time in 1979.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about it until you mentioned it. I guess while we were doing all of the research, I kind of got lost in the information, but there is kind of a weird pattern going on of things happening far back toward the 60s and beyond, and then showing back up in the late 70s.
Well, we recently, when we talked about H.H. Holmes, our last podcast, Monsters Among Us, on one of the regularly scheduled shows, we brought up the fact that what was taking place with him in the late 1800s was the same time frame that Jack the Ripper in London was taking place. And we asked the question, was there a generational thing? What was going on that was causing these things to bubble to the surface at the same time? I feel like it's a similar thing here, because a majority of the events that we're talking about happen within a decade of time from each other, but most of them have a history, almost a secret history, that reaches back 10, 20 years prior. There's this slice of time where all these very strange but similar and brutal events are taking place.
Very true, and it starts off in this particular case, I think in 1957. That's when we can at least find the first tragedy happening in Crystal Lake, and specifically in Camp Crystal Lake. There was a boy by the name of Jason Voorhees who, I guess he was born with a disease that caused his head to be abnormally large. He had some learning disabilities, so he was kind of bullied. At that time, he was, during that summer camp basically, eventually he was actually pushed into the lake by some bullies, some peers that just kind of made fun of him. In an unfortunate turn of events, the adults at the time happened to not be watching, and Jason drowned in the lake. So very sad. The year following that, though, 1958, there were 2 camp counselors who were actually murdered, found stabbed in one of the loftier buildings there at the camp. So given this event or set of events that was starting to transpire, they actually closed down Camp Crystal Lake for some time. And they did try to reopen it a couple times, but each time something seemed to go wrong. There was a fire one year that burned down several of the buildings. One other year, somebody was injured in some of the renovations of those buildings, and going back after that, it seemed like the water itself was dangerous, like it had been poisoned or something. So eventually people just gave up on it, and they actually started spreading rumors about it being cursed, giving it a nickname of sorts, which was Camp Blood.
Yeah, it was almost as if this place was not meant to be, and people probably would have been better off just leaving it well enough alone.
Yeah, which unfortunately they did not.
They did not. They decided to try it again.
Yeah. In 1979, 2 decades after it had originally closed, or nearly 2 decades after it closed, there was a man named Steve Christie. And he was actually one of the sons of the founders of the original Camp Crystal Lake. So I guess he had this duty, if you will, in mind that he had to reopen the camp, that it was his time to pass on the legacy. And I guess this was done kind of in secret. He had hired people from out of town to come in and be the next camp counselors and to help him kind of fix up the place. So when people in town started hearing about this, they were actually kind of upset about it. There was one man, he was a drunken man known around town, kind of as Crazy Ralph, who actually said that, they shouldn't be doing this, that it was a cursed place and that they were going to bring down hellfire and brimstone, basically.
Yeah, another crazy doomsday prophet type guy that probably had more insight and had more together than the rest of them.
Well, I think part of what people kind of wrote him off for was that he said, God has come down and given me a message that, people who go there are doomed and that everybody needs to leave that place. So he came off as being very over the top, and people just
anytime drunk people start saying that God has given them a message, I begin to tune out.
Well, that was part of the issue.
and apparently he rode around everywhere on a bicycle. It just made it all the more dramatic for this guy to be riding around town on a bicycle, always drunk, always talking about God's message of doom and gloom.
Yeah, and he would just kind of pop up in places, and then he would just kind of wander off and disappear. There was one, I guess part of the thing that happened actually was police had talked about how they were actually at Camp Crystal Lake on that Friday. They went over there to try and find him because he had reportedly disappeared in town, and I guess they were worried about him or what he was up to more specifically. So they went there thinking that he would find them, and I guess they were upset as well, just as the rest of the townsfolk, but they kind of let the people be about their business and left the camp, which is very unfortunate. Steve Christie also had to go into town that Friday, and he, I guess, got stuck during the rain. His car broke down, and he obviously wasn't going to walk that far during thunder and storms. He had no idea that somebody had actually snuck into the camp and had started to murder his new camp counselors. And I guess we should mention first, there was a girl named Annie who was murdered in the day before the rest of the events transpired. Nobody knew about it until later on, but her body was found in the woods. She had been stabbed in the stomach.
She was making her way to the camp.
Yeah.
But she had been hiking in from town, and I guess picked up by somebody who was driving that way, but then later found murdered.
Yeah. They do recall seeing her in town. Alice Hardy, who was at Camp Crystal Lake, reported that she was never, she never showed up. So we don't know how she was intercepted, but we do know that she was found later on, and it looked like she had been chased. She was kind of bruised up, and her knees were scraped after falling through the woods, apparently. So that was the first murder of the day. And unfortunately, the 7 other people that were at Camp Crystal Lake were then picked off one by one as well, in gruesome ways. This was not a typical case of a serial killer. This was disturbingly creative, unfortunately.
Yeah, as though it were premeditated and there was a systematic approach to taking out these young people.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about arrows being used. I guess one guy's cause of death was not being shot by an arrow, mind you, but being stabbed in the back of the neck.
Yeah, arrows that were previously found at the archery range that was being renovated. And
yeah, there was a girl that was bludgeoned in the face with an axe. There was another girl that was, I guess, beat to death and then tied up later on. So it's all very gruesome.
And like we said, folks, we gave you a warning earlier that some of these things were indeed gruesome and horrifying. So we're not going to go into too graphic detail, but we do want to share at least with you what happened, because the mystery is still out there.
It is. We do know who actually was doing the killing, and that was Pamela Voorhees. She actually was a cook at the original Camp Crystal Lake, and it was her son that was the boy that drowned in the lake.
It was kind of a revenge story.
Yeah. As far as we get out of Alice Hardy, she described Pamela as kind of comforting her that night, driving up and being somebody that was just driving up on an unfortunate situation. But then Pamela seemed to go crazy and started muttering to herself, started talking about how her son had been killed by people not paying attention to him. And then, according to Alice Hardy, something bizarre happened. She actually started speaking as if Jason was speaking through her, saying things like, "Kill her, mommy, kill her."
Almost like she was possessed.
Yeah, very disturbing, very bizarre. So Alice is able to fend her off and actually is able to hide throughout the camp at different points.
Which is fortunate, but it's just so strange because she's the only one that was able to defend against her. And not just once, but multiple times.
Yeah, she describes multiple altercations with Pamela. And it is also strange considering that Pamela was a cook at the original camp. You would think that she would know her way about the grounds better. Or maybe she did, but Alice was able to thankfully get away. And eventually, near the canoe section of the camp, I guess.
Yeah, down by the lake.
She was able to apprehend the weapon that Pamela was wielding and actually turned it against Pamela, killed her, and then was able to rest after that. And what happens next is what makes this truly bizarre. According to her, she remembers being dragged into the lake by a blackened person with a large head who she calls
like he was
Jason.
Scorched.
Yeah, and she calls him by the name of Jason. This is, as far as her memory goes, this is what she describes. The police actually did find her in the lake, and they drug her out before she was drowned. But they said they did not see any boy like she was describing. So the mystery still goes on to this day. What exactly happened to her? And what makes it strange is that she used that name Jason, like the boy from so long ago. Unfortunately, 2 months after these events, she was actually murdered in her apartment. There was blood found at the scene, but her body was missing. So while we know Pamela Voorhees was dead and gone, the question remains to this day, who killed Alice and why?
Yeah, and apparently stemming from this series of events, or at least allegedly and very loosely associated with this, there are other murders that had taken place throughout the years. And again, it's just a big question. There's a lot of people that claim that it's the same person, that it's Jason, that it's somebody acting like Jason, that all kinds of theories have arisen, but ultimately there are people who doubt that any of this has anything to do with it at all, of course, but the question remains, how are these people still dying?
Yeah, it's good that you bring that up. We know it's impossible.
That's what I'm here for, Michael. I'm here for this type of conversation right now.
It's good that you bring that up, that obviously it couldn't have been Jason. It reminds me of cases like the Beast of Bladdenborough, the big cat that reportedly killed a lot of dogs in Bladdenborough. Later on, the mayor was actually reported as saying, he fictionalized some of the events. Not all of them. The dogs definitely died, but he did embellish the story quite a bit to bring attention to that town.
Yeah.
And we do know that people did die, but a lot of, like you said, a lot of people doubt what actually happened, especially as the years went on, and people started to question whether this actually happened or not, or at least in the manner that we find interviewing people around town. So
yeah, because once again, we're basing a lot of the story on a traumatized individual that, to be honest with you, has difficulty functioning.
Yeah, and from there, even before that, anecdotal evidence. So there's a lot that still remains a question to this day.
All right, so let's move on. Several years later, there's another set of events that begin to take place in perhaps what is the most bizarre of the 4 cases that we have tonight. We want to visit the town of Springwood, Ohio. In November of '84, Tina Gray was murdered in her bed in a brutal and vicious attack while her mother was away. The circumstances of that night are particularly strange. Her mother was away from the house for the night, and her friends, Nancy Thompson and Glenn Lance, as well as Rod Lane, spent the night with her. Now, according to police reports, Rod had been sleeping in the same room with Tina, disappearing from the scene well before they arrived under suspicious circumstances. So this is a whole nother case with a lot of twists and turns involved, but it starts with the murder of Tina Gray and her presumed boyfriend fleeing the scene before the police arrived.
This is, and it's interesting, this was the event, out of all of the 4 cases that we talked about, this is the event that happened most recently. It happened in the 80s specifically, not in the 70s or even as far back as the 50s. But what really sets me on edge reading about this event, what really captures people's attention to this day, is that this almost has a paranormal edge to it.
Yeah, it's a lot less knives and grave robbers and stuff like that. It's very out there.
It is. There are, and again, some of this is anecdotal, some of this is based on the retellings of a girl who is traumatized in this case as well. But people describe what they saw, and this time it's not just from one person. This spread to too many people for this case, and like I said, it still captures attention to this day. So Tina Gray's murder site was particularly gruesome. There was blood that was smeared up on the wall and up around the ceiling, almost as if her body had not just been thrown there, but had actually been dragged up there, which makes no sense. There were 4 long cuts that had kind of gotten from her chest to her abdomen, and police reports describe something like a razor having done this, but they couldn't find any weapon at the scene, and I don't think a weapon was ever actually found. Obviously, because Rod Lane, who was actually her boyfriend, was at the scene of the crime and fled the scene of the crime, he was immediately the main suspect in this murder.
Yeah, and which would have made sense if a weapon hadn't been found and,
right.
and he got away that night. You know, he could have hidden it, tossed it, whatever.
Yeah. To be fair, he did have a list of minor misdemeanors. He was known for being kind of a hothead. Like I said, he and Tina had just had a fight not too long ago. So he immediately was in that hot seat. The day after the murder, he was actually caught talking to Nancy Thompson, Tina Gray's best friend, who had also been in the house that night, but who had not seen Rod because he had already left the scene.
And unfortunately for him, Nancy's father was a lieutenant at the police department. He's the one that was kind of heading up the investigation.
Yeah, he had actually expected Rod to come back. I guess he knew him well enough to know how he operated. So he actually had people tailing both Nancy Thompson and Nancy's boyfriend, Glenn, expecting that Rod was going to show up. And he did. So Rod was actually chased through the streets. He was apprehended with nothing more on than jeans and a leather jacket. He was immediately taken into custody and put in jail. Nancy tried to defend him, saying that it wasn't him, it couldn't have been him, it didn't make sense, but nobody listened to her at the time.
Well, and what makes this even more bizarre and even sadder is that Rod, not long after he was incarcerated, was found dead in his cell. And of course, the first thought is he committed suicide. But the circumstances surrounding this and the evidence presented in that cell and around his death spoke of something very different. And like you said earlier, almost, and I hate to say this in such a case, but almost paranormal.
Yeah, so he was found strung up in his cell with his prison sheets, or his jail bed sheets, wrapped around his neck. And I do say wrapped around his neck. They weren't tied in any knot. They were just almost wrapped like a snake around him, which doesn't make any sense for that to support his weight.
Yeah, that doesn't hold very well.
Furthermore, the sheets were tied to a rafter in the ceiling, which were well above the bars of his holding cell. We're talking probably a good, I don't know, between 5 and 10 feet away from the bars of his cage. So there's no way that he could have tied that as a noose. Some people still say that he did tie that as a noose. They deny any sort of paranormal activity, if you will. They also say that, or some other people who deny the paranormal activity also say that this was probably something to do with foul play, that somebody in the police station actually did this just to make sure that he didn't get away with it.
Right.
Either way, basically, he died. And
well, basically, he certainly died. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The guy was dead.
What happened next, I think it was the following night, Glenn was actually murdered as well. So we know that even if, I guess there could have been two killers, or it could have been a copycat killer, but the methods were not the same each time, so that's highly doubted.
Well, I don't think it could have been a copycat killer. And here's why. There's 3 murders within the course of just a couple of days. The killer more likely would have been working with someone or multiple people. I don't think it would have been copycat. It was too soon, not enough stuff out there in the public. And furthermore, the murders, none of them look alike.
It's very true. And the next one was probably the most bizarre and probably the saddest as well. Glenn basically was, I guess I can't say he was found. The strange thing about this is there was no body. There was just blood everywhere. It was an insane amount of his blood that had been spread across the room to the point where it was actually causing damage to the ceiling below his room.
Well, and what's unfortunate is that his mother found him, or found the scene.
Yes, and I kind of want to talk about that because her police report obviously is probably impossible. What she described is almost like a fountain coming up from his bed of blood. And as far as we can tell, she had just been traumatized by the events, and I can't say that I blame her. That's not something that's good to walk into, so it's pretty harsh. And to substantiate what she went through, it was said by one of the police officers at the scene that the coroner, as soon as he walked in that room, he actually left and started vomiting. So this wasn't just a small case of hysteria. This was something that was pretty volatile. That same night, I want to step away from the events in chronological order and go back and explain something, but I need to say real quick, that same night, the killer was actually stopped. He was never really found, but the killings actually ended at that point. Nancy Thompson, the girlfriend of Glenn, actually lived right across the street. And obviously she knew what had happened because of the police cars that drove up. She had spoken with her father when he arrived to the scene, and she knew that he was dead. She was very saddened by this.
Yeah, and her father's the lieutenant that we spoke of earlier that was on the scene pretty early.
Yeah, so she was pretty distraught. She was also kind of locked in the house. Her mother had kind of taken to drink at this point. She was known for being an alcoholic around town, and it really took a hold of her at this point, so she was kind of out of the picture. But before her mother had gone to bed that night, she actually barred up the house. So there were iron bars over all the windows. There were heavy locks on the doors so nobody could get in, and Nancy herself could not get out. She called her dad and basically said, "I know who the killer is and I know how to stop him. Come to the house within 10 minutes. And unfortunately, nobody came to the house. I guess she was kind of prepared for that, though. Let me go back and explain what she had been through. Her best friend just died. Her best friend's boyfriend just died. People had witnessed Nancy falling asleep in class and then waking up screaming. She was going through a pretty hard time at this point.
Yeah, definitely.
And understandably so, but what she was describing to people was a man from her dreams that was doing this, which is strange.
Yeah, it takes the case to the bizarre level plus 10.
So finally, I think it was the night that Rod died that kind of drove this in, or maybe it was before that, I can't remember. Her mother had actually taken her to a hospital where they were doing sleep studies, and submitted her to a short program, I guess, where they were trying to put her to sleep, because she, at this point, she refused to go to sleep. I don't blame her on one hand, but they forced her to go to sleep. The doctor there at the time had reported what looked like normal activity first, brainwave activity, but that activity actually went off the charts. It was completely unprecedented, and it terrified everybody in the room. Nancy herself started thrashing in her bed, so they went to wake her up, and her hair, or at least a strand of it, had turned white, so she was extremely stressed out. But what's strange is that she woke up with cuts on her arms. Some of the people in the room said it was self-inflicted to kind of support her claims. What they can't explain is that she also woke up with a hat in her arms, and she didn't walk into the hospital with this hat in her arms.
Well, and they certainly wouldn't have let her in that room and keeping that, or been in that room with cuts on her arms untreated.
Yeah. So at this point, we have something that is to this day unexplained. And what happens next, the same night that Glenn was murdered, continues to rattle people to the bone. And nobody really knows what went on.
Yeah, needle ticking to the red on the bizarre meter still. Yeah. It's just out. It's just really out there.
So, like I said, she kind of expected for nobody to come to her. You know, she was kind of the doomsday speaker throughout these events.
Right.
So nobody was giving her any credence. What had happened is she actually booby-trapped the house because she expected the killer to come after her next, which he did. And he stumbled through the house through these booby traps, and she actually led him to the basement where she set the guy on fire. At that point, she had garnered enough attention, screamed enough, broken enough windows that the police noticed her, came, and her father, leading the way, broke down the door. They did not find the killer, but they found evidence of him being there, evidence of him being on fire as well. In that same amount of time, in the confusion, he had killed Nancy's mother. Similar to Glenn, her body was never found, but thankfully, I don't know what she did, but she kind of drove the guy off. Now, if you thought this was bizarre, here's where it gets really strange.
Mm-hmm.
She mentioned a name, and I guess, according to her, she got the name from inside the hat at the hospital, but the thing was thrown away, so we can't really verify this. She mentioned the name Kruger to some people.
Right.
Now, if we go back and look into Springwood's history, there's a guy, I guess we should start with the killer. There was a killer called the Springwood Slasher, and this was a guy who primarily went after teenagers and younger children.
Yeah, and this was decades earlier.
Yes.
In the town's history, so there's already a sordid history at play here.
Yeah, and this guy, he would kill kids basically, and then scatter their remains throughout town. So he was extremely, just a very nasty individual, but he was caught. Due to a technicality and I guess a botched trial, he was released. This man's name was Frederick Charles Kruger. Although he was proven to be the killer, he was released, and the parents of the children who were murdered and some of the other parents that, felt sympathy for them, they got together, and in an act of vigilante justice, they actually cornered him in his workplace and set the building on fire. His remains, I guess, were found later on. So we know that he couldn't have been the same Kruger that Nancy spoke of, because he had died in a fire so many years ago, but people haven't really come up with a better explanation either.
I mean, could it have been a relative? Truly, at that point, could have been a copycat from the decades earlier killer?
It's possible. Not much is known about his family. Kruger, I guess, had no true parent. He was adopted by a guy who...
Well, no known true parents.
Yeah. Well,
obviously he had parents.
Yes, but he was adopted, basically.
Right.
He came from, I guess, unfortunate circumstances, was adopted, and had an abusive relationship there, grew up, and I guess he seemed like a good family guy on the outside. He did have a wife and daughter. I don't remember what happened to his wife and daughter afterward, and I can't find a record of what happened to them, really. So I guess it could have been a relative. Somebody passed on from him, but it seems unlikely. That being said, like I said earlier, there's not really a good explanation that has been given to this day. It remains, like I said, one of the most bizarre cases, and it still takes that paranormal stance.
Nobody's put two and two together completely on this one. There have been several people who have been arrested since this time attempting to recreate those events, which is unfortunate. It was just, most of it was just really sloppy work. And thankfully they were caught, it was stopped, and hopefully this thing will not be resurrected again. Now, whether or not we ever solved the case, I don't know. But it certainly fits into the narrative of our topic, Monsters Among Us. These four cases, a lot of similarities, very brutal and gruesome all the way through, and all of them in our modern time. So there's still a lot of stuff out there that we need to be watchful and be mindful of. These guys still out there. And then, of course, people trying to copy it and make it happen all over again, which is just ridiculous. People just leave this stuff alone. Just walk away. But thankfully, we've got better technology and crime fighting ability in this day and age, where it's not as easy to recreate these events and for people to get away with it. So thankfully, we're in a different era. But again, this wasn't too many years ago that at least the last of these took place.
Yeah. While some of these events were, like you said, brutal and unfortunate, and definitely the body count is up there, they are still kind of isolated, thankfully. It's not like, Henry Howard Holmes or Elizabeth Bathory, the two that we've spoken on in this series so far, who have such a long history. This was something that at least was contained to a smaller time period.
Yep, absolutely. So, folks, we hope you have enjoyed this special Friday the 13th edition of the Monster Guys podcast with our topic this month, Monsters Among Us. If you have any further thoughts or insight on any of these cases, feel free to contact us at themonsterguys.com, on Twitter at themonsterguys, on Facebook, The Monster Guys. We'd love to hear from you. These are, for all intents and purposes, still open cases for the most part.
Yeah, I think except for the case in Haddonfield, Illinois, it's pretty open and unsolved.
So there's a lot of questions still that need to be answered. So if you have any insight, if you've followed these cases or know anything about them, we'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, we do hope you enjoy your Friday the 13th and are ready for a spooktacular Halloween. Until next week, thanks for being with us. It's a privilege to speak to you each and every week. I'm DC.
I'm Michael.
We are the Monster Guys, and we're bidding you good night.
Good night.